The human eye is very sensitive to colors, and when an artist goes to use color in a composition, the contrast between colors can either make or break a relationship with an image. Right now, I'd say this image has a high tension color scheme. Yeah, it's harmonious, as we talked about earlier, but it's a little hard on the eyes. It's all peaks and no valleys. Now, we know there are more aspects to color than the hue. In fact, I really think the human response to color is a lot more about the contrast of the image than the colors used. And contrast levels come from two distinguishing characteristics of color: saturation and value. Let's talk saturation first. To me, saturation is like the inner life force of your color. High levels of saturation get your heart racing. A lot of saturation definitely draws the attention of a viewer, but can really quickly exhaust the eye. In cartooning, there's two sides to saturation. It can be used to create a happy, kid-friendly appeal and exaggerate a reality. Lower levels of saturation can bring out a somber mood and can make a story or character feel a little more mature or grounded. You'll notice right below the saturation slider is the light slider, which is technically the value slider. I'm playing with this, but we'll talk more about value in a minute. Just like with the hue, I move these around till I'm happy, and my final settings are just really subtle changes. I've only reduced the saturation by 13% and the lightness by 7%. It might not seem like a big deal, but it's just enough to give my image a slightly moodier edge. So now that I've tampered the energy of the colors, let's bring some reality and visual depth to the character by playing with value. For the most part, value is the environmental impact of your color. That means the shadows in your design. I like to color my shadows and highlights using layers set up with clipping masks. You can apply a clipping mask to a layer by right-clicking and selecting Create Clipping Mask from the middle of the Layer Options menu. When a clipping mask is applied to a layer, you've told it that its visual boundaries are defined by a base layer, which is the one below it. I know that's confusing, but you can see that while I'm painting shadows on this new layer with a clipping mask applied, no color seeps out from the boundaries of the block color layer. This can really save me some time because now I don't have to worry about paint going outside the edges of my character's silhouette. And you can stack multiple layers with clipping masks, one on top of another, and they'll always reference that base layer. You could even use the white silhouette layer we created as your base layer to avoid any spillover from any of your color layers. Let me point out some other settings of my shadow layer. Style of shadow work is a really personal artistic choice, and this is just how I do it. I set the blending of a layer to color burn, and I lower the opacity to 30%. I try to do all my shadows for a project with the same deep purple color. For one reason, I like the way this deep purple responds to most other colors on the color wheel. And, even more importantly, it helps me keep my shadows consistent over the course of a project like a comic book. My highlights are done in basically the same way, but instead of setting a layer to color burn, I set it to color dodge. When creating highlights and shadow, I try to keep in mind a scene's source of light. If you don't know where your source of light is coming from, the default position is going to be the upper right-hand corner angled down at the character's face. Imagine a stage light pointing at an actor. My approach to value has two sides. I use value practically. I want to show the depth of objects, and I want to conceal and highlight important aspects of a character design. But I also use value narratively. In this case, the shadows change the way we respond to this character's face. Look, I've added a dark shadow under the eyebrow to give this guardian a bit more intensity and almost a menacing feel. When it comes to hand gesture and brush settings, my style of shading is basically the same as my inking style. I use the same brush and various levels of smoothing to create soft and bubbly shapes of shadow and light. If this shiny cartoon look doesn't really appeal to you, try switching to a more textured brush, like a watercolor or a pastel brush. Texture is going to bring out a more impressionistic sense of color in your work, but it's also going to add a lot more character. So experiment and see what works for you. At this point, we've finished coloring our character design. But stick around, I've got one more bonus chapter on extra color effects, like changing a scene from day to night and coloring your line work.